Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Talent Talks webinar. My name is Werner Oberholzer, and I will be your host today for our discussion. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our morning together for the next hour. So Talent Talks is a powerful online reference library to help business owners and HR professionals effectively manage talent from recruitment right through to retirement. And you can find us online at www.talenttalks.net or follow us on LinkedIn for the latest Talent Talks news at Talent Talks Africa. So before I introduce you to today's topic and our esteemed panel of extraordinary women, there's just a few housekeeping things that I'd like to run through with you. First of all, we are using a webinar platform today, so you don't have to worry about keeping yourself on mute and watching your webcam. We're doing all of that's being taken care of for you. For your best viewing experience, we suggest that you select the gallery view in your Zoom options, and you can find that in the top right-hand corner of your screen. There's a little button there and you can just select gallery view. We are going to be taking Q&A at the end of our discussion today, but you're welcome to use the Q&A function in the bottom of the Zoom bar at the bottom of your screen to post any questions for our speakers and our facilitators. And if we'll handle these questions during the discussion today, but also at a dedicated Q&A slot at the end of our webinar. And we also invite you to add any comments and thoughts you'd like to share with the rest of the attendees using the chat function. Now, before I introduce you to our topic and our lineup of speakers, we're going to run a quick poll just to get some things, some thoughts, your thoughts, and to get our discussion today started. So I think we've got a good few votes that have come in the poll. I'm going to ask Trevor to please close the poll for us and then bring the results up so that you can see. And it's very clear that there's a significant investment going into leadership development as an area to strengthen gender equity in our organizations, as well as mentorship programs, and rethinking organizational culture. So I am going to take us into the next stage here and just introduce you to our topic today and our panel of extraordinary women who will be joining our discussion today. So next week, on the 8th of March, we celebrate International Women's Day. And it's that moment every year when we pause to recognize the contribution that women have made across all the different aspects and spheres of life, and particularly the work that's being done to shape a more equal world. In the last year in particular, we've seen powerful examples of female leadership on the front lines of the COVID crisis, whether they are caregivers, scientists, community organizers, or leaders in business and national government. But the last year, we've also seen a highlight and the spotlight being cast on just the disproportionate burden that many women carry, especially when it comes to the burden of care. And so there are growing concerns that after decades of gains that we've made in building more equal workplaces, that we now are at risk of seeing some of that progress being undone due to the effects of lockdowns and also just the shifts that have come into play to address the risks and the issues around COVID-19. So our panel today is going to zoom in a little bit, and they're going to discuss the steps that businesses can take to avoid undoing all the great work we've done so far in creating a more gender equal workplace. So I'm very pleased to welcome our facilitators today, Tembela Njenga and Ricky Minyuku from Wuniko Transforming Spaces. They will be facilitating our discussion, and joining us panelists, we've got Benita Kaluri, a talent acquisition and engagement specialist, Priyal Ramdas, leadership and performance consultant, and Zani Mashinini, HR executive. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ricky and Tembela to handle the rest of our discussion.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to get us started this morning. As I was introduced by Verna, My name is Ricky Minyuku, and I am with my partner in crime, Tembela Njenga. We are from Womanical Transforming Spaces, and we focus as an organization on gender equality and creating the kind of spaces where women can contribute to making the kind of policy and practice shifts that ensure gender equality in the workplace. We are so excited to be asked to hold this space, although it is a challenging task to have such a deep and difficult discussion over such a little bit of time. But we're going to try and get through all the different issues that we can get through, and we have an amazing panel of women that we'll be discussing with today. So in respect of time, I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to start our discussion with Priyal. So our amazing, phenomenal panel of women have extensive experience, long bios, and in the name of saving time, we're just going to keep it short on why we want to hear from these amazing women. So Priyal, for example, has 22 years of experience as a corporate executive, and she has focused most of her work on leadership development and executive coaching. So with this background, Priyal, the question I would like to ask you is, why does gender equality matter at all? And what does an organization need to do to meet its gender equality goals?
Thanks, Ricky. Well, Ricky, I have to start by saying that it's actually twofold. You know, there's a human case that there's a fundamental human right for everybody to want equality in life. But there's also a very compelling business case. I mean, there's accumulating data and research for decades, for more than decades now, that show from McKinsey, Harvard, and other institutions that with better equality, organizations can achieve much more. There's research to also show that with better equality, this can boost productivity and profitability by more than 21%. So there's definitely unique benefits that women bring to the table, as do men. So it's not necessarily, one over the other, but it's about how do we build a partnership. We need this diversity to push and help people develop and grow. So the more equal the balance is that you get in an organization, the better you are able to achieve real, tangible results. That's better decision-making, more innovation, and actually you make more money. So, even if we have to just look at new entries in the world today, globally, you can see that there's over 70% of new entries in the workplace that are actually women. And that looks very different to what we see in terms of leadership teams at the moment. So if we don't do a proper or a look to proper representation, we'll continue to fail to see the solutions the world actually needs. So COVID-19, Verna and yourself, you've spoken about this already, has actually just provided a massive wake-up call. So along with other signs that we may have been ignoring over time, but basically to show what we're doing in the world, how we're doing things, what do we prioritize, and it's actually not working. We do need a more diverse and inclusive environment, but not only that, more diverse thinking processes and solutions, which means involving more women. I mean, how can we have, lack of representation of 50% of our world's population? So it's really interesting to kind of work with this now, because if you think about it, many women over this period in COVID as well have been asked questions like, if you could get a raise, a promotion, or a week's vacation, or flexibility, what would you choose? And there was an overwhelming response that came across saying that actually we want flexibility. And this is especially true for women who are raising families. So essentially, women leave organizations because of how we treat mothers in the workplace. But what's also interesting is that this research shows a similarity to what millennials are also looking for. So if we want to improve, and if we want to know if we need to improve, all we need to do is look at the data, right? So what's the data telling us? How many people are being promoted? What type of individuals are being hired? What is that gender representation in the C-suite? What is the retention of women over men? And are we having those candid conversations? And what do our team meetings actually look like? And that gives us a keen sense of actually what the status is. And the real question that everybody should be asking is, what could a more gender equality environment look like? And what would that mean for us as organizations?
Thanks, Priya, for that. That's actually quite a helpful start of this conversation, and you are really directing us at data. And I, honestly speaking, if we were to do that, I'm sure we'd be doing much better than what we are doing currently. And on that note, I will move on to Zani Mashinini, who's got, we've already heard that Zani has got 20 years of experience in human resources across the globe, both in Africa and beyond. And Priyal has actually mentioned that there is a serious challenge here. And she also mentioned estimates, for instance, that show that if we were to address gender equality, we'd actually be doing much better in business. I just want to mention, before I come to your question, one of the data that we've actually come up with is that African GDP would increase by 11.7% if gender equality was addressed. But we also know that not enough is being done across the globe, in Africa and in South Africa as well. Your question, Zani, why is it that we are not doing enough around gender equality? What do you think are the reasons that we are not seeing enough progress in advancing women in leadership? So basically, what is holding us back? And perhaps when you answer that question, you could also look both at the systemic issues as well as the individual challenges that we face around this area.
Yeah. Morning, Tembela, and morning to everybody who's watching and joining us this morning. Great question, Tembela. I think it's going to be one of the most focused areas, I think, in diversity and inclusion as to what's holding us back when it comes to looking at D&I from a gender perspective. And I love and I enjoyed what Priyal shared with us, because we're not short of the reasons why we should do it. We're not short of initiatives and ideas of what we should do. In my observations and some of the research that I've done, and I spend quite a lot of time coaching women, and one of the biggest themes, and this will apply to diversity and inclusion in general, as Priyal mentioned, there's also a different generation that we are looking to start, employ within the workplace. It does start with how the tone that is set, Tembela, in an organization. And I think one of the most important questions to ask is why an organization feels it's important for them to actually look at gender diversity. And I think that answer will set the tone as to how committed the right stakeholders are, because commitment is going to be one of the most important factors to look at. And we found that commitment or lack of commitment is seen in organizations who probably give up, because we are going to make mistakes. We are going to do things we've not done before. And typically when they don't succeed the first time round, they hire the first C-suite woman or executive, and they find that it's not a success story for them. And they tend to then think that it shouldn't be repeated. And that is why the why is so important. The other things we're seeing is the culture dynamics are not included in those interventions. So they're often executed in isolation. So it's either we're going to fix representation and hire more C-suite executive, females, and not look at what does it mean to actually have the first woman in a male-dominated environment or a male-dominated team. And once we look at the entire, you look at your impact studies, just understand what does it mean what does it mean to start a meeting at 8 o'clock for a woman who's got 3 children to take to school, for example? I mean, if I think of my own experience being part of a C-suite team, is I remember there was two of us women, and I remember my colleague saying to me, my female colleague saying to me, I wish the meetings would never start at 8 o'clock, because I noticed every morning we had our usual catch-ups as an exco, she'd rush into the meeting room huffing and puffing because she's had to drop off for children. And I'm not limiting it to a woman's experiences, but that's just a story I'd like to use to demonstrate why it's important to look at things far more holistically. I also think it's important to understand that when you do things in isolation, for example, you saw in the poll, there's lots of ideas, lots of initiatives that organizations are embarking on. But if we're just going to do the leadership program, you know, we send women on these amazing programs. You've seen business schools offering a lot of those. Women will attend, they come back to the workplace, and there's no way of implementing those learnings. As I said earlier, we go on a huge drive to hire women in senior leadership positions. They arrive in the environment and the culture is not receptive. We've not thought through the impact of actually shifting those dynamics within the workplace. So I do think it's important, to your point, to look at things systemically and not look at it in isolation.
Thank you, Zani. I'm going to jump straight to Benita, who is sharing with us from her 20 years of experience in talent acquisition, and maybe pulling from what Zani was saying, and from what Priya started us off with, the impacts of the COVID pandemic have been significant on talent, and especially on women in the workplace. And some of the impacts that we have noted is that an S&P survey said 30% of family caregivers are reporting increased stress because of having to balance the work-life demands because of COVID lockdowns and having to work from home. And another study that we found by the Institute of Fiscal Studies showed that 50% of women were using, they paid hours in order to fulfill household care needs, because they had to do childcare, more meal preparation, remote education. Everybody remembers what 2020 was like. So the question I'd like to ask you, Benita, is what are some of these issues in the workplace, and for women as well, that we now need to face in the COVID context, and some of these issues that can reverse the gains that have historically been made, and in particular looking at that work-life balance, that work-life integration aspect of it?
Great. Good morning, Ricky, and good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. I think it's such a fabulous question, and I think that we can all relate to it in some way, shape, or form. And you know, Ricky, in the work that I do, I'm speaking to people on an ongoing basis. And yesterday I spoke to somebody who said to me, she hasn't taken leave since 2018 and she's just completely burnt out. And how do I take leave when there's so much to do and so much to get on top of? And I think it really comes back to us feeling as women that we are absolutely inundated with a multitude of different things to tackle in any given day. And so how do we get on top of this? And for me, one of the great things that I've learned along the journey from one of my teachers is that we have to be able to use the power of discernment. And what I mean by that is that we have been inundated with a whole lot of things that we need to get done. So how do we bring back into the picture the power to choose? And I love a quote that Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, uses in his book, where he says that between the stimulus and between the response, there is a gap. And in this gap is our power to choose. And so I love this because I think what it does is it really brings back into the picture that we as women do have the power to choose. But what we need to do is we need to be creating more of these gaps for ourselves. And you know, this is not new information. Many thought leaders talk about this. And what we're saying is use these gaps, and I love to call it a breath gap. So whilst we are going through what we need to go through during the day, use these breath gaps to pause and to think about in that moment, is this what I need to be doing? is this the right thing for me in this moment? Because what we're doing by using these breath gaps is we're enhancing our ability to self-monitor. And if we enhance our ability to self-monitor, we are then able to better self-regulate, and we're better able to deal with the stress and the anxiety and the excessive worry, which just goes with what we need to really get done on a day-to-day basis. I also read a study that was really fantastic a while ago that spoke about self-help tools and meditation and journaling and morning routine and evening routine. And the number one thing that sat at the top of that list was that we need to be kind to ourselves. We need to show up in a way in which we have empathy for ourselves and in which we're doing things for ourselves to fill our own cup. So one of the things that I've started doing is when I start a new day, I've started saying to myself, I'm going to do one thing that's going to make me happy today. And whether it's sitting on the couch and watching Bridgerton for an hour or going and having a really great piece of chocolate cake, whatever it is, as women, we need to be really zeroing in on how do I choose what is right for me in this moment, and how do I use those breath gaps to navigate what it is that I need to navigate on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Benita. So I think the issue is, how do we tie all of this together, right? We know that we're able to generate gender equality in business if we understand the business case, and we're able to get businesses to show commitment, resilience in the process, as Zani has shared with us, and to integrate the culture issues. And then what Priyal has shared with us is that we do need a leadership level commitment, right? We need to understand why this is important. And she shared with us the human case, the business case, and we also know that there's a social case for this. There's a social case to the extent that women contribute. It's been proven that women contribute 90% of their income when they earn. It actually is reinvested in the family. So for development of a nation, ensuring that women stay in workplaces is important. So I want to take our conversation back to Zani, and I want to ask Zani, considering the context where we've got new challenges coming into place, considering what you have unpacked for us as to what are the challenges that hold us back from doing this work, what do we need to do to change the narrative, Zani? And I'd really like you to zone in on what women can do to support women, because I see that that's one of the issues that has come up in the chat box.
Yeah, I think there's a lot we still need to learn and do as women. But just generally, I think let's not exclude. As much as we talk about diversity and inclusion, we could fall in the trap of, let's do this for women and we leave the men behind. We're doing it for younger people and we don't include, the generations that have been around for long enough to share wisdom, etc. So I think from a gender diversity and inclusion perspective, because we have men that are dominant, that have led the way up until now, it's very important to get sponsorship from male leaders when it comes to these issues. So I think that's very important to highlight. And that goes for whether I'm designing a leadership program, whether I'm in charge of employment equity, whatever the case may be in your organization. And I think what's also important is to remember to teach women to network. I think as women, we need to understand that there's a lot we have to still do on our side. Let's learn to network, and let's also learn to sponsor each other. So I could be in a C-suite role. Have I actually mentored? Am I sponsoring? Am I coaching? What is it that I can impart to ensure that we're seeing that that growth in representation and participation by women? And I think what's also important is to remember that our D&I initiatives also need to be integrated. And I think that's something I'll keep repeating, because if we don't do that, then we often find that we give up. We see that the pace goes slower, and we find that a lot of women themselves get left behind. So I think it's quite important that women are looking at how can they support each other. There are often they're not myths, they're actually proven, that women tend to find it difficult to sponsor one another. And so a lot more work has to be done amongst women. We talk about social capital. So using social capital amongst each other is going to be quite important to see some of the changes coming through.
Thanks, Zani, for that. I pick up three important things that you are raising there. The issue of sponsorship, both by men and women, and also like on the side of women, you put quite a lot of responsibility there in terms of like networking amongst each other and making sure that we use our social networks to support one another as women. And I think the one other thing that I like in what you are saying is that we need to take a systemic approach to DI. I don't know, Priya, I'll move now to you. I don't know whether there's anything else that you want to add on what Zani had said, but before you add, if you want to add anything, I want to ask a specific question to you. As a leadership expert, what is that one thing you think leadership can do to make a positive impact on gender equality in our current context?
Thank you, Tembela. It's a really powerful and important question. And I think it's basically building on what Zani says. We've been doing isolated interventions, and we really need an integrated leadership strategy that talks to not just about what women need to do in terms of their own leadership and sponsorship and supporting each other, because if you're not at the table, you can't influence a different conversation or different narrative. And so more women need to bring others to the table. And we need to actually achieve critical mass. The other element is around culture. So what are we doing from an organizational culture perspective to ensure that we have a supportive and inclusive culture? And that happens from the top right the way to the bottom. And then I want to build on what Zani spoke about, using men as sponsors, but I want to take it a step further to say, how can men become advocates for women and support, not just, because by supporting women's development and bringing this equal gender space into our environments, you're not just helping the people in our personal lives, but you're actually growing the next generation. And so really looking at men who have a sense of fairness and integrity, almost wear this on their sleeve. And you can actually identify them, because integrity is not something that you conceptualize, you see it in the moment. And so you can identify those individuals that can actually be used as true advocates, not just sponsors, but those are the ones that call out bad behavior, and are able to flip it, to test the assumptions and the unconscious biases that we actually hold within our environment. So it's really making sure that in order for us to achieve a systemic change, there's a multi-pronged approach in how we address this. I just want to say one last thing, that it actually takes a village. I'm using a bit of creative freedom here. It takes a village to raise an organization. And so the roles of different individuals, and we need to come together for the greater good of not just one kind of gender, but for our community, population, and society at large. Thank you.
I love that, Priya. It takes a village to raise an organization. Because honestly, if we were to look at our organizations and assume that there were people, then perhaps we'd put more effort in terms of addressing the issues of gender equality. And the men in here, you've had it. We need men that can act as advocates to actually address the problems that we are facing here. It could actually be your daughter who's actually experiencing problems in the workplace, or it could be your wife or your sister. Benita, let me come to you. And again, we're looking more at what is happening at the individuals. The question I have for you is, what are some of the considerations women as individuals need to focus on to brand themselves differently in the workplace, whether you're talking about for the purpose of finding new roles or personal branding in their current role? So what are those considerations that women as individuals need to focus on to brand themselves differently in our current context if we are to come closer to addressing issues of gender equality.
Great. Thanks, Tembela. Well, you know, in the work that I do, which is recruitment and talent engagement, we're seeing a really interesting shift from a personal branding perspective. And so what we're seeing is that COVID really pushed us all almost into a forced pause scenario where a lot of us had to take stock of our lives, whether that be professional, whether it be personal, and where it is that we wanted to go. Now, from a talent engagement specialist, informally, we're always doing work with people around really getting them to zero in on what their strengths are, what their unique capabilities are, and what they're able to bring to the table from a very differentiated perspective. What we're seeing now is very interesting. We're seeing a shift in branding from object referral to self-referral. And let me qualify that a little bit. So if you think about branding from an object referral perspective, people are really going to be driven to brand themselves by what's happening from an external point of view. So what have I amassed? What are my credentials? What are my achievements? And we're seeing now that people are starting to shift a lot more into self-referral based branding practices, where they're talking about, actually, I want my brand to be the sum total of my experiences, my failures, my fears, my anxieties, because I realize that that is what makes me who I am. And so from a branding perspective, what we say to people now is, how do you really get into that deep internal excavation of understanding who you are? Because once you're able to do that, you not only have a clearer sense of where you want to go within the organization, but you're able to project yourself in a far deeper and more meaningful way in the world as well. So it's really exciting for us from a talent engagement perspective that people are talking about not only positioning themselves in terms of everything that they've done right, but really bringing to the fore all of their growth experiences and helping them to then use that to navigate as they move up in their trajectory.
Thanks, Benita. So the discussion we've had has been quite intense, moving from kind of global level down to the individual level. What is it that women can individually do? What do we need to be looking at within organizations? And how do we see this in a global picture of a global pandemic that has not only challenged women in leadership and gender equality in the workplace, but it has also created a space and an opportunity to reimagine and to really plan how we can do things differently. We're going to be moving to our Q&A session next. But before we jump in, I want to just go back to Priyal for a moment, because if you listen to the discussion, it seems like, oh, very difficult work. No one seems to be able to do this. It seems like such a difficult task to wade in on gender equality. And I want to ask Priyal, from your extensive experience, are there examples of organizations that are being effective in doing gender equality initiatives in the world of work? And how can we learn from some of these examples?
There's a lot more, thanks, Vicky. There's a lot more international examples of companies that are doing it well. And at various times in history, you would find organizations that are accessing different elements of the different initiatives. And the reality is that there's no silver bullet, and there's no one way. And there are lots of organizations that are finding different initiatives and are moving the needle, but not actually making that significant shift that we'd like to see. There are countries like Iceland, Sweden, etc., more northern hemispheres, where you see a lot more in terms of ranking that you see in the World Economic Forum, etc., where you see that. And where there's a lot more deliberate intention and action in terms of recruitment processes, talent management processes, etc., from end to end, that ensures that people or more women are actually involved and are part of the working environment. So, you know, it really is an opportunity for the conversation to expand. around what are organizations going to start experimenting in. And that's the behavioral sciences element, to say we often don't know what we don't know. And we're almost stuck. Like we said, CEOs know that it impacts the bottom line. We know, we agree about that. But yet, there's no sense of urgency. In terms of the sense of urgency, it's often number 3 or 4 down the line. So we're stuck in that no sense of urgency in order to, and we're not going to reach that critical mass. So yes, what we are finding is organizations tend to use a lot more of women leadership programs in developing women, in developing competencies, etc. And it talks directly to the weaknesses women bring into the workplace of saying, I think I need one more competency before I can do this. There's research to show you have a job that's been advertised, you have 10 requirements. A man might have 6 out of the 10 and raise his hand. A woman would look at it and only apply for that position if they've had 9, 10, or 11. And so it's really about saying, how are we going to lean in more, and how are organizations actually going to start taking more deliberate action in terms of ensuring that there's more women in shortlists. There's a more structured approach in how you're re-looking at the practices of how you're recruiting and promoting people, etc. So yes, Ricky, basically it's more in the global environments. On a local front, you have multinational organizations that are doing some sterling work, but in isolation and in individual initiatives.
Verna, are you coming in? Are you ready for our Q&A?
No, we're actually bringing in Verna before we come to the Q&A section.
Sure.
Great, thank you, ladies. So we've had a couple of wonderful questions that have come through. Tembela, shall I give them to you one at a time, and then we can get our panelists to respond to those?
Please go ahead, Verna. I'm actually not able to see. In fact, there's one that I can see, and maybe you can actually help me to answer those questions because I'm not able to see them. The one question that I would want to bring up is saying, I would be interested in knowing which questions we should ask to ascertain whether our cultures would be supportive of diversity and inclusion. So any one of you panelists, you can actually respond to that. Zani, can I pick up on you?
Yes, I started with the wrong button. Apologies. I think that's a phenomenal question. I think the one that I think I may have shared it with Verna is first ask individuals, who are they mentoring, and are you willing to mentor? And I think that question goes back to the authenticity you bring in this whole initiative. As soon as we make it quite clinical, we make it about governance, and we ask questions at that level, we miss the individuals that you want to bring along, and you catch it at that level. So asking questions that are personalized, that's about taking it back to individuals, whether it's women, whether it's men, whether it's younger people, is very important. So that's the question I would like to recommend people start with.
Thanks, Annie. Another question. My experience has shown that men want to be included in the gender equity conversation, but I'm not always sure what to do and how. How can we support men in being more involved and active in the conversation so they don't see themselves as being left on the side?
I see Priyal's off mute.
Yeah, if I can, excuse me, if I can take that one. I think it's really important for women as a starting point to create a safe environment to allow and invite men into the conversation. I think that men want to be good parents, want to be supportive people, and so there's it's really about being curious. There's something I wrote in the chat as well, that men and women experience the workplace very, very differently. So it's really about those candid conversations and curious conversations about how are you experiencing it? You know, and by sharing examples and conversations in that way, you are inviting a sense of curiosity and openness to start learning and start understanding from both perspectives.
Thank you. I think there was a question, it was a point actually that was made by Benita, if I am right, where she was actually saying that women have power to choose. And I think the question that I would like to raise there, Benita, is what happens to women who are actually saying, yes, I know that I have the power to choose, but within the organizational setup itself, I don't feel that I actually have that power.
Yeah, Tembela, I think it's a great question. And I think that unfortunately, it's one wherein many women do find themselves in that position. And I'd just like to tag on to what Zani was saying about forming these mentoring relationships, forming these support relationships within the organization. Because I do think that if we come from a place of curiosity, as Priyal had said, if we come from a place of genuinely wanting to make a positive change versus it's a us versus them, men versus women, that we're able to bring more people into the fold. And so I think finding, it doesn't necessarily have to be everyone in the organization. It doesn't have to be the most senior person at the uppermost level, but finding someone to engage with and really doing it from a place of sincerity and genuineness, and then and being more inclusive and bringing other people into the fold. I think often we feel, and I think I feel that it is a misnomer, that it's really got to cascade from the top down. But I think with any kind of movement that's gained momentum, it's about people that are passionate, people that are committed, and growing the fold from there.
Thank you, Benita. That is actually quite helpful. Verna, I'm just going to put you on the spot and just check if there's any other question perhaps that you have seen that you think is quite important there, and maybe we can just take another maybe another 2 minutes to just throw more questions to the panelists. But after they have responded, I would ask Ricky to just come up and summarize maybe for 2 minutes before we hand over again to Talent Talks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tembela. Yeah. We do have some more questions. There's one that's popped through in terms of biases. So we all know that we have biases. It's the way our brains work. It's the shortcuts it's developed over many years, or many millennia, or thousands of years. So how can we highlight these biases in our organization, and how can we support people in understanding where their biases are lying, and use this work to help create more inclusive and more diverse work environments?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one, Vernon. The reason I wanted to contribute, and I'm sure others will as well, is gender unconscious bias has been one of the barriers, and I didn't raise it earlier. And unfortunately, as much as we resist the conversations around discrimination, the studies, the research, the anecdotal conversations still suggest we are facing discrimination as women in the workplace. And remember, discrimination comes in various forms, whether conscious, unconscious, and it's informed by many, many reasons, whether I have fear as a male, or whether I don't understand why we're doing this, why it's important. So I think the work does need to start with, why is it important? And we've heard great intro from Priyal earlier, and I think we often miss that step. We don't go and look at the impact and include individuals and actually talk about why it's important and the benefit for individuals. It's not just about making an organization look more diverse and make it a PR exercise. And yes, there's a business case for it, but it's also important just as a leader to know why it's an important skill to have. And then it becomes about teaching leaders as well around the importance of it, and then understanding for you what are your unconscious biases? Because often we don't help people understand that. We don't give you the tools to say, hey, actually, this is what you have, and you unconsciously doing it. So I think that's a good starting point from my perspective, Verna.
Verna, may I also weigh in just on what Zani said as well?
It would be lovely to hear your perspective, Benita.
Okay, great. I think the word bias has such a negative connotation to it. And I think that what it is that we've got to realize that people have been socialized in different ways. And yesterday I read an article, because there's a movement in the men's world that's gaining a lot of momentum around men being socialized in a kind of a boys don't cry manner that impacts the way they lead and the way that they engage with the world as well. And so I think it really comes down to how will we socialize? And like you said, some of this stems back thousands of years. And how do we get to a point where we can acknowledge that this is really a part of our makeup, and that this sits in who we are and the way that we engage, and really does create a barrier to more expansive and more open-minded engagement. And through that lens, then have these conversations around, so what do we do? How do we take it forward from here? And realize that it's very, very much a part of the growth and learning pathway as well. Being really able to tap into that and to do the work, because it's all a work in progress at the end of the day. Thank you.
I love that perspective, Benita. And I suppose adding to that, a couple of times in the discussion today, we've had references to curiosity and being, asking. And I suppose part of dealing with our different ways of being socialized is to be curious about how other people experience life and how they experience situations, and to learn from that. Tembela, Ricky, we've got another question that's popped up, specifically being asked to Zani, but I'm sure that some of our panelists would also like to weigh in, and that's around networking. So Zani mentioned networking is a critical skill, and the question, or the person would like to know what advice you can give about how to network, where and when. And I know from my own experience in building a business, it is definitely a skill, and it's something you have to learn and you have to work at. It wasn't something that came very naturally for me. So I'm also curious to hear what Zani is saying.
And exactly that, Verna. I've spent a lot of time coaching women, and this is the topic we always send, our conversations are always about networking. There is theories around it that, women are often the ones that are sought after by men. So we tend to wait to be pursued. But I don't want to use that to kind of influence the conversation. But there are those theories. And in reality, what I found is that women tend to hold back a bit more. They're not going to risk and approach somebody they don't know. So we actually talk about it in coaching. How do you approach a sponsor? How do you actually approach a mentor? And I found coaching is a very good practical way of getting going in this regard, because you've got somebody who walks with you, somebody who helps you debrief, reflect on the attempts you've made. But the best tip I can give is to just do it. And I always say to people, you reach out to 20 people, trust me, 1 or 2 will respond, and you're already in the game. So for me, just do it. And if you can seek coaching advice, get tips. If you've got people like Verna, everyone who's here today, reach out to people and ask them, how did you do it? Certainly the women that I've been working with, those are some of the ways we've been able to overcome this. And we've seen a lot of progress and a lot of success. So don't hold back, and have the confidence to do it as well.
That's a very sage advice. Thanks, Zani. We'll all go out and just do it. Just get busy. I think, Ricky, Tembela, we probably have time for one more question. A question's popped up on the Q&A board from Kushbu. I've seen male leaders take offense to a woman challenging them, and yet they respond differently to male counterparts in a similar scenario. Do we have any tips we can share on navigating this? Women tend to back down to avoid agitating these leaders very sadly. We'd love to hear from the panelists your thoughts on tips for navigating those difficult circumstances.
So if I could just maybe weigh in on this, Verna. Thanks for the question, Kushbu. It's a really important one, and one I've experienced and had to engage with many times myself. And really, it is about how you navigate these conversations at the starting point. There is generally a bias in terms of not wanting to be shown up by women often. And so typically you will find, some bad behavior where, a leader might talk over a woman or dismiss what you're saying, etc. So in this particular situation, it's really important to start building that relationship and possibly start on a one-on-one. I like to be a little bit provocative and sometimes challenge those assumptions, and in a safe environment, almost flip it to test it around saying, well, if I was a male peer, how would you have responded to me then if something like this does happen? To kind of raise that awareness. And what I also found that works really well in situations like this is when you have sponsors or advocates with you supporting what you have to say or invites you into the conversation. So almost coming in via a different direction, to support people and leaders starting to get used to actually being challenged by the opposite sex. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyal. Thank you, Benita. Thank you, Zani. It has been an amazing discussion. We've gone into great depth. We've gone broad and discussed so many issues. I just want to try and summarize some of the things that we have shared this morning. So first of all, we've shared, why does this matter at all? Because there's a human case. Everyone wants to be seen as equal. There's a business case that was laid down for us very thoroughly by PR. And this business case includes that there's an increase of 21% in profits when you include women in businesses. That 70% of new employees into the workspace are women. So it is becoming a talent recruitment issue. We also know that 80%, and I don't know how many people know this, 80% of global expenditure is either controlled or influenced by women. So it actually is also a client issue. And so there's a strong business case for why we should be doing gender equality. And I also mentioned that there's a strong social case. We talked about the difference it makes to development in society. We then talked about what are the challenges that organizations face. And here Zani was so helpful in unpacking what are some of these challenges. She was saying, really, if we don't have commitment at leadership level and a commitment that looks like doing the hard work, that looks like receiving the challenging engagements that Priya was talking about, that looks like understanding why this matters for your business, we're not going to be able to walk the journey. She talked about companies that give up, that don't have the resilience because they see failure. And then Zani shared with us that it is so important to have an integrated initiative that really looks at culture, and that helped us delve into detail as to what are some of the cultural dynamics that we have to pay attention to. We have some wonderful stories of just some simple impacts, right? Simple impacts like having to get to the office for an 8 o'clock meeting. Simple impacts like what is happening in the childcare context, in the COVID context. So those are some of the places that we want to be looking at to do policy, practice changes, cultural changes. We also then had a really powerful engagement about what are the personal changes that people, that employees, that team leaders, that managers have to go through in order to make gender equality happen in the workplace. And here we were talking about really getting to grips with your unconscious bias, really looking at setting up mechanisms and systems for women to be more included. So setting up empowerment mechanisms to help women to network, to understand their own network challenges and to help them to network and to build social capital, mentoring and building sponsorship networks, and finding advocates amongst male leadership for gender equality. And then we went down to the level of the personal, and Benita was giving us some very powerful views at the personal level. She reminded us of the power of discernment. So taking that breath gap to take a moment and make a choice about what you can and cannot do. Understanding that by being kind to yourself, You're enabling yourself to show up in the best way in the workplace. Understanding that if you're seeking sponsorship, if you're seeking network opportunities, as Zani said, just do it. Dive in, take the courage, and you will find the answers that you're looking for. Understanding that when you're presenting yourself as a brand, as Benita said to us, you need to give a deep, reflective presentation of yourself, not just the successful stories, but also your journey of learning and growth is really helping us to understand the person that is presenting in an organization. I don't know what to say. As I said, empowered, wonderful women that we've had on the panel. And I also want to point out some really amazing comments that we had in the chat. Mariana Fortain, for example, pointed out to us that if you're an introvert, there are also ways to find, to be able to network. So combining that self-awareness and understanding yourself as a brand and finding mechanisms to network, which might not be something that's your particular strength. And then I really don't want to mess up this name. I have to slow down. This Nyasha Dashi Matanga said a powerful thing about we don't see enough women at the top, because the truth about it is seeing is believing. When you see women in leadership positions, then you can see that you can get there. Then you also know that you already have advocates and you already have support in the leadership position. I want to leave you with just one statistic. And that statistic shows that if you have 30% leadership of women in an organization, you are more likely to have the right policies and practices in place. Where the numbers dip below 30%, then it's less likely that the right policies and practices will be put in place. So when we're looking at the systemic and the catalytic changes we need to put in place, we need to be ensuring women are in leadership. We need to be ensuring that the practices and policies are put in place. We need to be ensuring we're creating empowerment spaces for women. From my side, I want to thank you for an amazing discussion this morning, and I'm going to hand over to Rena to close us out.
Thank you very much, Ricky and Tembela, for a wonderful facilitation and a discussion today. And a warm thank you to our extraordinary women on the panel, Benita, Priyal, Zani. Thank you for your thoughts and perspectives. We'll be back with another webinar in April. This time we're going to be looking at business continuity through human continuity. So please keep an eye out on our newsletter, subscribe to the newsletter if you haven't already done so, and follow us on LinkedIn at Talent Talks Africa. We will be sharing lots of exciting events coming up in the next few months. As I said at the beginning of our webinar today, Talent Talks is a powerful online reference library, and we aim to help business owners and HR professionals effectively manage your talent from recruitment right through to retirement. We've got a wonderful membership offering, and as a member, you can sign up for only 395 Rand a month to access an incredible set of resources, how-to guides, very, very good resources that were developed in the real world and tested by our expert panel. So do please come and visit us at www.talenttalks.net. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in April when we talk about business continuity through human continuity. All the best. Have a lovely Thursday and a wonderful International Women's Day next week.